The palace glittered with golden chandeliers, while just beyond its gates, a maid's house sagged in shadows, its windows cracked, its children pale with hunger. He was a prince, heir to the crown, raised in silk and silver. She was a dismissed servant, forced to choose between bread and fire for her little ones. The queen, cold and unyielding, had cast her out with cruel disdain, declaring her unworthy of even a name within the court. Yet one night, against all rule and reason, the prince rode through the dark streets and entered her broken door unannounced. What he found there would shatter duty, defy power, and change the course of his life forever. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. Candlelight ran like liquid gold along the edges of silver platters. The hall hummed with polite laughter, with the clearing of throats, with the fine orchestration of cutlery against porcelain. Perfume and wine made the air soft and heavy. The crown prince sat at the center of it, half turned toward a bland conversation he could no longer hear. He lifted a glass and did not drink. Across the long table, a pair of courtiers leaned too close to one another. Voices lowered, but not enough. They had the careless assurance of those who believed their words floated harmlessly in silk and music. "A former maid," one said, flicking crumbs with an ivory-handled knife. "Out in Stave Lane, I think. 2 little mouths and no bread. Poor creature." "Poor or foolish?" the other murmured. "There are reasons people are dismissed. One must suppose she brought it upon herself." The prince's hand paused on the stem of his glass. The rest of the hall glimmered and blurred. He watched candles burn themselves down by degrees and felt a small, hard knot tighten beneath his ribs. The hum returned in sudden clarity. Names, business, the usual bartering of wit and position, yet that one remark would not release him. 2 little mouths and no bread. He set the glass down. The sound was too loud in his own ears. The man to his right, a general with a chest of medals, said something about the week's inspections. The prince nodded and made a neutral sound. He knew how to perform agreement without listening. Whole years had trained him for that. "She was in service here," someone further along said, almost teasing, almost bored. "Imagine. And now, well." A shrug, a smile, a morsel of salmon lifted with elegant fingers. "The city does not forgive a misstep." Something old and stubborn stirred in him. He remembered the servants' corridors in cool morning light, the quick, competent presence that made rooms appear ready as if by magic. He did not summon a face. He did not dare. He pushed his chair back when the next course arrived. "Highness." The master of ceremonies leaned near, bowing from the waist. "Shall I inform the orchestra to prepare?" "I am unwell," the prince said softly. "The heat." The man straightened with sympathy shaped to duty. "Of course." He left not like a fugitive, but like a man who knew precisely how to vanish in plain sight. He made no haste through the side door, no rustle of alarm in the air he disturbed. Only when the thick doors closed behind him did he let out the breath that had been locked in his chest since the words had crossed the table. The corridor beyond the hall was lit by sconces and scented faintly of beeswax and stone. His boot heels on the runner sounded like a metronome wound too tight. He passed a gilded mirror and did not look at himself. He preferred in that moment not to see the crown in the set of his shoulders, not to see duty draped upon him like ceremonial cloth. He cut left, then right, into a quieter passage where the air cooled and the walls narrowed. Torches flared on their iron hooks. At the end of the passage, a door opened onto a small cloister of the inner court. Darkness sat like a patient animal in the corners. He stood for a beat and listened, to the fountain's low trickle, to the muffled laughter behind him, to the night itself breathing. Then he crossed the square with long, unhurried strides. A figure detached itself from the shadows near the arch, a tall man with a plain face and the alertness of a hunting hound. The prince acknowledged him with a tilt of the head. The man had followed him before and knew how to be unseen. "Your Highness," the guard said. It was not a question, it was readiness. I need a horse, the prince said, saddled now. The guard did not ask why. He turned, and together they slipped along the covered walk toward the stables where a handful of lamps burned dull and steady. The smell of hay and leather cut cleanly through the evening's sweetness. Somewhere a horse stamped and blew, impatient with idleness. A stable hand would have been summoned on any other night, but the prince did not call for one now. He did not wish for witnesses. The guard moved like a second thought, sure and silent, choosing a dark bay gelding, strong-backed and calm by nature. Saddle and bridle lay ready as if the animal had been waiting for this precise moment. They worked without speech, cincture tightened, stirrups measured by habit, reins gathered. Keep your distance, the prince said at last, his voice softened by urgency. See me there, not beside me. The guard's mouth pressed in a thin line. At a distance, then. The prince took the reins and swung into the saddle. The gelding shifted, steadied, and the door to the courtyard opened onto the outer court where the night had thickened. He rode under the high arch, past the guards at the gate, whose salutes were trained more to reflex than curiosity, and he went out into the streets. The city met him with cold air and coal smoke. Gas lamps pushed pale light in tideless pools, leaving corridors of black between. The prince kept the horse to a quiet, sure-footed pace along the large thoroughfare that ran away from the palace, past noble houses sleeping behind iron fences and shrouded hedges. Here, the street smelled of wintering gardens and the sea salt tang that the river carried through narrow alleys. Ragged clouds skated across a thin moon. He pulled his collar up against the bite. The cloth was good wool and held its shape even when abused. He thought of the cloth on her back. Foolish to do so, he did not know her. He did not know whether the rumor had gilded misery for the sake of a better story. But once imagined, the picture would not leave him. Two children huddled to a fire that offered more smoke than heat. A house that remembered better years, and now surrendered itself to why and how. The horse's breath made brief clouds. A dog barked once, twice, and then silence gathered itself again. The prince crossed into narrower streets where the facades drew closer, less paint, more brick exposed, more patched doors and window frames that listed with age and neglect. The air thickened with the smell of shallow drains and coal that never burned quite clean. He glanced once to his left and saw the guard, a passage away, a shadow that matched his speed and kept his promise. The city was a living thing at night. It had its own circulations, its own strange heartbeat. A woman's laughter drifted from a second-story window and dissolved before it reached him. Somewhere else he heard a faint song, badly made, yet earnest. A cartwheel creaked. The prince held the reins with one hand, and his other hand closed itself and opened itself again on nothing. He did not know Stave Lane from the lines on his palm. He had never needed to. He looked for the signs that had been mentioned, the turn where the cobbles failed and went to dirt, the left-hand row where a lantern was hung on a hook that had lost one screw so the whole thing canted like a bird's crooked beak. Whether he had imagined that detail or heard it in the half-laughing description in the hall, he could not be certain. He guided the gelding through a narrow twisting street and felt the city alter, tighten, lose its polish, gain its rawness. A man with a cap pulled low watched him from a stoop and did not challenge his passage. The prince kept the horse to a walk now, not wishing to be the sound of authority galloping where authority came rarely, and only to take, never to give. He listened for children. He listened for hunger, as if it made a sound. He had not known hunger's sound. Perhaps it was only silence with a kind of edge. He reached a junction where the street divided into two. The right-hand alley sloped toward the river and glimmered where black water showed like a wound through broken boards. The left-hand lane was narrower still. He turned left, and the horse's shoes struck sparks once on flint, before the pavement changed to something rougher. A lantern hung indeed at a cruel angle on a bent hook, its flame hesitant and odd. He drew rein. Houses leaned into each other like exhausted men. In one, a window-paned light flickered and steadied and flickered again, a heartbeat caught in a brittle cage. The prince felt the smallest shiver that had nothing to do with cold. The horse shifted its weight and blew quietly, patient. He dismounted at the corner of a house with a step that sank a fraction, because the ground there was not as firm as it pretended. He laid a hand along the horse's neck, and the gelding put its head down as if to scent the earth. The prince looped the rein around a post whose paint had long gone to the city's memory. He glanced up the lane and saw the guard at the mouth of it, motionless, not so much a man as an intention. The house directly before him had a door that had been painted blue once. The paint had cracked and withdrawn into islands. The shutters on the upper window were broken on one side, so the plank hung half loose like a shrug. Through a crack in the lower window, light forged itself out of weakness, refusing to die. He did not knock immediately. He stood inside his own breath, letting it calm, letting it tell him he was one man on one night doing one thing. Long habit wanted to call for an attendant to go forward, to announce him, to clear the way of insult or danger. That habit had no use here. If the woman within had 2 small mouths and no bread, then time measured itself by another instrument entirely. He raised his hand and let it hover. Fingers curved toward the weather-swollen wood. He could smell damp in the frame. He could hear a small sound within, no more than the shift of weight or the complaint of an old chair, or perhaps only the house remembering movement that had gone on and on for years without anyone who mattered hearing it. He dropped his hand again and pressed his palm flat to the door instead. It was a strange urge to touch the same thing this door touched precious little of: fresh air, possibility, some slender idea of deliverance that might arrive foolishly after these hours. The wood answered with its own silence. He stepped back. He looked again toward the lane's mouth. The guard did not come. The guard did not move. That steadiness worked upon him like a benediction. He turned back to the door and did what he had been bred not to do, what he had been bred to have done for him. He pushed. It creaked open on its own reluctance. The smell that greeted him was of thin broth gone watery with repetition. The room beyond was no more than a single space divided by use and hope. He could not see far inside from where he stood. The light was low, and the fire that made it burnt more smoke than flame. The draught that his entrance created tugged at the candle on the table, making its wick gasp for oxygen. He saw a chair, a rough table, a blanket thrown over something like a pallet on the floor. He did not step across the threshold yet. From the hall, echoing faintly in his skull as if from another life, he heard one of those careless voices say again, "Poor creature." He stood in the door with the city's cold at his back and the house's cold before him, and felt anger move slowly inside his chest in a new shape. Quiet, not the flash that made one speak, but the iron that made one act. Behind him, the horse shifted, hoof to hoof, a soft ring on stone. The lantern outside guttered and steadied again. The prince leaned to one side and saw how the window's cracked pane had been mended not with new glass, but with someone's careful hand. Resin worked along the split, a patient repair that would not invite admiration because no one would ever see it. He had not known that kind of work. His life had been built of works meant for display. He spoke then, the first word he had offered to this house. The word was her given name in his mind, but he did not say it aloud. He had never been permitted to know it. He said instead, low and careful, "Are you there?" Silence took that offered thing and turned it over. There was movement near the pallet, no more than the pull of a blanket, the shift of weight. He imagined a small hand where a child's hand would be, curling in sleep. He imagined the way a mother's body made itself a wall against drafts and fear. He imagined these things because they were true in 1,000 rooms like this one, not because he had ever stood in one before. Another draft licked along the floor as the candle near the window reached nearly to its last. The flame trembled, refusing, and then yielding to the thin breath of the night, then found itself again and burned a fraction brighter, blue at the edge, gold at the heart. He could see now the line of a chair's back, the collar of a dress hanging on a peg as if someone hoped for a day when it might be worn outside with head high. "Highness," the guard's voice came softly from behind him, only just above a whisper carried by the lane. "Shall I?" "No," the prince said, without turning. "Stay." The word settled between them like a placed stone. There were courtesies, and then there was need. He did not know which he had brought more of into this house, and he did not try to name the difference. He placed one foot across the threshold. The board spoke in a tired tongue. He paused again, letting his eyes adjust to light that had been asked to do more than it had to give. The fire on the hearth showed itself to him in parts, a sliver of orange, a shelf where someone had set two bowls side by side as if symmetry were a kind of hope, the delicate curve of a spoon that had been mended with wire. The sight made the back of his throat ache. He had not intended to feel anything. He had intended to bring a bag, a coin, a solution. Solutions were what he had been taught to carry, yet the act of stepping inside undid something that solutions never touched. He could not name it. If he gave it a word, it might leave him. He thought, briefly, ridiculously, of turning back. He thought of sending means through some discreet channel that would keep his name far above and his hands far clean. He thought of giving an order that would satisfy the physician in the story he would tell himself later. But he knew the difference between a story that let one sleep and the truth that would follow him through whatever he did for the rest of his life. He had not known it, and then he knew it. Some things one learns only by walking into an unlit room and refusing to retreat. His fingers curled at his side, then uncurled. He felt how empty his hands were when they were not holding the reins, or a pen, or the ceremonial sheets on which he signed his name under words he had not written. He felt that emptiness as possibility. He realized, with a small shock, that this emptiness was the only honest place from which to touch another life. Light shifted. He raised his head. The candle's flame gave a subtle jump that did not belong to the draft. Somewhere in the house, something had changed its breath. The prince took one more step, and his shadow laid itself along the floorboards in a clean line that would, if one cared to measure, lead directly to the door of the poor room where a woman sat in the half-dark, listening. He lifted his hand to knock at last, to announce himself as gently as the moment permitted, to cross fully from thought into deed. And in that exact heartbeat, the fragile candlelight inside trembled, as if the house itself had flinched. The tremor in the candle was small, but he felt it as if the house itself had taken a breath it could not hold. He rapped lightly on the open door with his knuckles anyway, a courtesy that sounded like hesitation. The sound was soft. Even so, it seemed too large for the room it entered. He stepped over the threshold. Cold slid around his ankles first. Then the thin warmth tugging off the hearth reached him like a hand held out from a far shore. He took in the narrowness. A table set askew to fit around a missing plank in the floor, a chair with a rush seat that had given way in one corner and been mended with careful string, a shelf fixed to the wall with a mismatched bracket that had been polished with something like love. On the shelf, an empty jar, a heap of folded rags, a crust of bread the size of a palm. The scent of broth, boiled down and then sparingly revived, lingered like a memory. She sat by the grate at first, unmoving, as if fear and pride together had turned her to stone. The fire gave off a wavering light that made a traveler's dusk out of the room. Only when the draught his body brought in reached her did she start. Her hand went to the chair's back. Her other hand reached without looking and found the blanket on the pallet. The blanket rose and fell with two small breaths beneath it. She stood. "Highness," she said, breath gathering itself around the word and making it almost a whisper. She lowered her eyes and then lifted them again, not in defiance, but because the habit of looking down could not hold when there was so much before her to guard. "I was told." He stopped and let the words unhook themselves. "The night is cold," he said instead, and only then realized what a foolish thing to offer to a house that had lived with cold As with a relative it could not be rid of. He shut the door behind him, closing the draft in with the smoke. At that small act, the room changed in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. The house, if a house could do such a thing, seemed to draw itself in, as a careful woman might pull her shawl closer to hide the thinness of her sleeves. He tried not to watch the gesture she made to smooth the blanket over the small bodies there, but it was impossible not to see it. He had seen countless formal bows, but not this. "Forgive the hour," he said. The apology felt both laughable and necessary. His voice made a small amount of warmth by itself. He felt it leave him as visible breath. She steadied herself with the chair again and shook her head once. "You should not be here," she said. It was not a reproach. It was a fact placed between them, like the table catching a falling cup. She tipped her chin toward the door, not to send him out, but to say there were eyes in the world which did not belong inside this room and would try to enter if they could. "I came alone," he said. Her glance slid, quick as a swallow, to the narrow window. The crack there caught a bead of condensation and turned it into a tiny lens. Alone meant one thing to him and another in a street like this. She did not answer him on that point. Instead, she drew the chair nearer the hearth, put the flat of her hand against the kettle, and lifted it with a rag so carefully that not a drop spilled, though there was not much to spill. He watched the steam ribbon up, thin as thread, and then vanish. "Do the children sleep?" he asked. He did not intend to step closer until she gave that permission without saying it. "They do," she said, "when there is nothing to keep them awake." She poured from the kettle into a bowl that showed, even in this light, a pair of small chips along the rim mended with workman's wire. She didn't offer it. She set it down where the steam might warm the air and make the room smell like hope, a little. He looked at the shelf again. The crust of bread drew his eye like a lesson. He had eaten bread that day without noticing. He had broken a roll with a thumb because the conversation had required a casual gesture, and he had liked the warmth of it on his skin in a way he had not permitted himself to like anything else at that table. He looked at that crust and measured the space between his life and this one in a way he could neither shrink nor enlarge. "You were in service," he said quietly. "Here." The last word made a strange shape in his mouth. Her fingers, lifting a log that was hardly a log at all but a leftover split of wood, paused mid-air. "I was," she said. The piece of wood sat onto the embers with a stubborn hiss, as if it resented being asked to burn again. She did not look at him when she answered, but her voice was steady, the way a beam must be steady if it is to hold any weight. One of the small bodies under the blanket moved. A child curled tighter, knees drawn, and a thin cough followed, no worse than any cough a child might make, except it was in this room, and that changed the sound of it. The other child stirred enough that a hand slipped free. In the hand, held not as a child holds a toy but as a sailor clutches a scrap of wood after a wreck, was a little horse carved with no skill and all devotion. The edges were worn smooth in places where restless fingers had worked at them, as at a worry stone. He felt the tug of a story he did not know. He looked away, ashamed of his own instinct to make that horse into a symbol so he could understand it better than he understood the child. He noticed then that the floor had been swept into neatness despite the missing plank. The broom stood in the corner, straw bent from too much use, yet banded with a bit of ribbon, saved from some earlier life. The ribbon was faded to a shy color between red and brown. He was not the kind of man who saw ribbons, but he saw that one. "May I sit?" he asked. She hesitated. The chair in front of him was not sturdy, and there was the matter of position. Who sits where? Who is home? Who is guest? Etiquette here did not have a book, yet every step felt written. She gestured to the chair nearest the wall, the one that would put him out of the path between the pallet and the fire, the one that meant he would not be in the way if the children woke frightened. He understood and took it. The chair complained under his weight. He sat with more care than he had sat on any gilded throne, as if he feared to break this thing that had borne so much already. His knees were suddenly too long for the room. He tucked his boots back, and felt dust unstick from the boards. He folded his hands and found nothing in them. He opened them again. "Why did you come?" she asked. He could not give a reason that did not sound like vanity dressed as mercy. He could not claim that he had come to fix the world. No knight will bear that lie. He could not say he was curious without making her feel like a specimen. He could not say her name because he did not hold that gift. He told the only truth that did not ask her to carry the weight of his motives. "I could not stay," he said. She looked at his face fully then. In that movement, the lifting of her eyes, the steady inquiry there, something of the room changed again. The fire made a new shape of shadow on her cheekbone. The line of her mouth, pressed flat for so long, softened and then found itself. She saw the cloak he wore, plain enough to pass in a dark street, yet still cut by hands that had always known the measure of privilege. She saw the way he held himself as if the air itself were watching and judging, and might write a report. She saw, too, a naked bewilderment at what hunger does to a room. "You should not be seen here," she said. "I will not be," he replied. "Not if I can help it." Her gaze flicked once more to the window, and he did not follow it. He did not turn. He let the reminder stand like a person at the edge of a conversation that cannot easily be asked to leave. "Do they have a physician?" he asked after a small silence. She did not laugh. There was not enough left in her for that. But her mouth changed, as if a laugh had passed through it some time ago, and left a memory. "If they had a physician," she said, "I would be a different woman." "Then, please," she said very softly, not to him exactly, but to the air between them that had begun to fill with the clumsy or eager offers men make when they wish to feel clean again. "Do not make promises you will not be allowed to keep." He took that blow and did not defend himself. He had the sudden impulse to inventory the pockets he had not brought. No purse large enough to throw at this problem, no instrument by which a life can be levered from one place to another without breaking. He reached up and loosened the clasp of his cloak, not because he was warm, but because the fabric felt like a barrier he had to peel back to be of any use at all. There was a pause. The room made its small noises. The fire found a new pocket of pitch and spat. The kettle bumped the hearthstone once and settled. Outside, a cart rolled far away, and then was gone. The two children slept on. He felt the strange urge to speak nonsense to fill the quiet. Weather, roads, things people say to avoid the questions that matter. He kept still. "Would you like me to go?" he asked at last. He meant it. He would stand up, and he would go, if being here cost her too dearly. He tried to remove his own desire from the offer. "If you leave the door open," she said after a moment, "the cold will take the night from them." He closed the question then with his hand on the latch. The smallest of her smiles, so small it was hardly more than a relief of tension, visited her mouth and then was gone. She took the bowl from the table and moved it nearer the pallet, letting the steam find the children's faces. The little carved horse had slipped a little in the grasp of the child who held it. She adjusted it, not to keep it from breaking, but to keep it from falling away. He watched her fingers do that with a carefulness that felt like a prayer. A spark lifted, died, and left a faint scent of pine. He saw then the state of the shoes by the door, a pair of small boots that had been polished with something that was not polish until they shone anyway, and another pair hardly more than a suggestion of leather, stitched in a way that tried to make one thing two. He remembered the thought that had met him in the corridor when he left the hall, that he was one man on one night, and felt ashamed of how large he had imagined himself in that sentence. "Sit," she said then, gesturing to the second chair at the table. "If you must be here, do not hover like a man who thinks he will be caught at a window. You will not ease my fear by looking like it." He obeyed, and the simple choreography of her instructions settled something between them. He placed his hands on the table, palms down, as if to promise he would not reach for anything. The table remembered 100 meals it had not held. He felt that memory under his skin. "Is there anything I can—" He cut himself off when her eyes lifted to his with a softness that was also iron. "You can listen," she said. "You can look." He did. He let the room tell him its story without interruption. The cracked pane mended with resin where a glazier would not come. The bucket tucked under the drip from an invisible seam in the roof, emptied before it could overflow, evidence of someone rising in the night again and again. The hearth swept even of ash where women often stop, because ash is a clean mess compared to others. The line where laundry would be, if there were more than the one set they wore. The absence of clutter that did not speak of neatness so much as a life cut down to its bone. "What will they eat in the morning?" he asked, and then cursed himself for the stupidity of the question. "What we have," she said. "And if we have nothing, we will make something from hot water and faith, as mothers always have." He stopped, because he had been about to say he would send something. He would. He knew it. He did not know if that would be allowed. He did not know if his sending would make trouble greater than hunger. He did not know whether he had come here to make a promise or to ask for one. "You are not a priest," she said, not unkindly. "You do not have to absolve us." The remark was not a door closing. It was a gentle pushing away of a habit. He accepted it. He looked at the children again. The older of the two had rolled to their back. The blanket had slipped to the waist. He saw the ridge of a rib beneath thin fabric and felt anger cross his face like a shadow. She saw it and shook her head once. No. Do not bring anger into this room as if it were a gift. She had too much of it already, and it fed no one. He left it behind his teeth. "Are they warm enough?" he asked. "They will be," she said, and he heard the quiet gallantry of mothers in that tense. It made of the future a present obligation, and so brought it nearer, manageable by inches. He wanted to say her name. He wanted to know if the sound of it would change the room. He wanted to give his own, not as a weapon or a coin, but as an admission of ordinary self. He said neither. Sometimes withholding is kinder. "Do you mind?" he asked, nodding toward the little horse. "If I—" Her reply came without bitterness. "It is his. He sleeps better when he keeps it." "Of course." He kept his hands where they were. "It is a fine horse." "It was made with a pocket knife," she said, and then stopped herself, as if she had opened a curtain too far. She looked at the children again. "It was made," was all she allowed. He nodded. Silence bent around the two of them, not unfriendly now. The house, having been entered by a prince, resumed being itself. The kettle whispered. The tiny flame at the candle grew tired and then rallied, faithful as a heart that refuses boredom. He thought of leaving and could not move his legs. He thought of staying and counted the costs as if coins lay on the table between them. What would kindness become once it stepped outside this room and was seen? What would his presence do to a life already balanced on edges? He opened his mouth to say he would return. He closed it again. He had not earned the right to put the future into her night. The small cough came again from under the blanket. The child half woke, eyes cracked open, dark in the low light, lucid in the way children are when sleep loosens their tongues from fear. The little hand tightened on the wooden horse. The mouth formed around a thought that had been carried like a pebble all day and all night. The child turned toward the fire, and toward the voices, and toward the shape seated near the wall. The child spoke, not to be cruel, not to accuse, but because truth in small bodies will have its way with air. They said Mama had to leave the palace because she made a mistake. The child's sentence hung in the air like a dropped spoon, small, clear, impossible to ignore. The prince felt it first as a sound, then as a shape, then as a weight that settled against his ribs. He had come expecting facts or faces. He had not come expecting this exact, clean confession delivered without malice. The words were small and unadorned, and that made them crueler. He did not answer at once. He had never been accustomed to the bluntness of children's conclusions. In the palace, conclusions were dressed in paper and politeness before being announced. Here, Speech arrived unvarnished and precise, like a bare nail where a hook should be. The child's hand tightened on the wooden horse, thumb rubbing the groove where a pocket knife had carved a mane. The old animal's edges had been softened by years of use. The prince noted that with a detail so quiet it was almost sacrilege to his realities. The maid's shoulders moved as if to gather something invisible around them. Pride, shame, the remnants of a posture once maintained for service and then set down. Her face folded in on itself for a moment as if to hide. He saw the way she sucked in a breath and let it out measuredly, the way a woman who had long practiced modesty waited for instruction from the air itself. "It was a mistake," she said, finally, and the words were brittle with history. They wanted rescue and refused it the same minute. Her eyes were on the kettle as if the kettle could answer what she would not. He took a breath that smelled of coal and horsehair. "Tell me," he said, almost machine-like in the steadiness of the request. He did not expect her to comply. He wanted, secretly, to be refused, so that his presence would be an offering rather than a theft. The truth was more insistent. It did not want to be boxed. She shook her head. The motion was weary and absolute. "Not here," she said. "Not because of you, but because there are ears that come through doors that are not ours." Even the way she spoke this made him hear corridors rather than rooms. The palace leapt into the quiet like a silhouette the moment the suggestion of listening was made. He understood without the words. He had been trained to read the shape of silence and the color of a glance that meant far more than the phrase it accompanied. He had also been trained in a lesser art, staying where one belonged and letting others belong where they must. That training felt suddenly two-faced. He felt each face turn toward him and demand a choice. He moved closer to the fire, not with the calculated grace he used for public entrances, but with an ungainly, purposeful step that surprised him by how much it cost. The flame warmed the air around him by a few degrees and made the room smell like toasted grain and old lace. He could see the tendon at the side of his own hand stand like a cord. He could see the maid's hands, calloused in different ways from his own. Her fingers were deft and quick. They folded the blanket with a motion that was economy and ritual at once. The children breathed shallowly. The small cough that had interrupted the night earlier rested like a pebble in the bottom of the room, making the floor incline toward it. The prince wanted, absurdly and pointedly, to take both children in his arms and measure each rib himself to banish the worry with action. He had thought until that moment that doing so would be easy. He had, as it turned out, been inventing muscles he did not yet possess. "Why did you leave?" he asked, not in the blunt manner of inquiry, but in the soft cadence of someone trying to earn the words that would be trusted. He framed the question so that it would be small enough to fit between the boards of this house, so that it would not collapse the fragile arrangement of dignity she had built. Her hand paused in mid-fold, fingers holding the fabric like a seamstress holding a secret. She did not meet his eyes. "Because I had to," she said. The sentence contained so many tributaries of sorrow that it might have been a map for anyone brave enough to read it. Because to stay was to watch them starve while they pretended nothing was wrong. He listened to the line of her reasoning as if it were a piece of music he had not yet learned to read. The notion that a woman had chosen shame to protect her children felt both noble and raw. In the palace, the language for such things was softer, couched in euphemism and wrapped in a history of silence. Here, the absence of comfort made virtue visible as an act rather than a phrase. "You were dismissed quietly," he said. It came out more like a fact than a question. He did not want to demand the story. He wanted the edges of it so he could see how much of the world it had eaten. She tightened her lips, then let them go. "Quietly," she agreed. The word was an echo of his earlier night at the hall where the courtiers had pronounced pity and judgment with the same breath. She bent to stir the kettle as if to avoid the vulnerability of looking at him then. The steam fogged a small patch of the air between them and softened their features. He considered the notion of quiet dismissals. The palace was built with them. Disgraces were rarely trumpeted. They were folded into the household accounts and filed away under unfortunate occurrences. To be sent away quietly was a euphemism for being erased with a kindness that had teeth. He felt those teeth now, as a conceptual ache. He had not known how much the idea of erasure could hurt until it had a human voice in front of him, taut with fear, yet steady as a post. "Do you need anything now?" he asked, though the question annoyed him because it sounded small and practical and could be turned into charity at a whim. He had no desire to offer charity that whispered of mercy and disdain. He tried for another tone and failed. The answer might have to do without the quality of his delivery and live or die on its honest content. She shook her head faintly, a horizontal shiver that meant both yes and no. "Food, always," she said. "Coal for the fire sometimes. A spare shirt for the boy would be like gold. But more than that," she added quickly, as if afraid he would reduce this list to coin. "If you mean well, do not make noise about it. Do not let them think this was a story to be turned for entertainment." He nodded. He would have nodded even if he disagreed. The smallest, deepest part of his being wanted to announce the solution with banners. A private, sensible man would have arranged help through stewardly hands and left the names unspoken. A more dangerous impulse wanted to keep standing in the doorway and change things by presence alone. He felt the pull of both and recognized he could not have them together without harm. He reached into the depth of his cloak without making it obvious and drew out a small packet tied in cloth. For a moment, he considered the theatricality of producing something, of making a gesture that might be recorded in memory like a tableau. He reminded himself this was no stage. He extended the parcel to her across the table with a movement that was quiet but deliberate. Her fingers touched the cloth and closed around it for a heartbeat, as if to measure whether it was a trap. When she unfolded it, the plainness of the contents made for a small, charged exchange. A roll of coins, a little bundle of preserved goods wrapped tightly, a ribbon he recognized as one used in the household when extra cloth was measured out for servants who had gone above their station. She did not speak. Her face betrayed a flicker of danger, and then a suppression so practiced it was almost pious. "You should not accept this," she said finally. The words were measured with dignity. She folded the cloth back with the care of someone who had learned to hide her sustenance well, and then placed it beneath the table as if to tuck it into a pantry that did not exist. "You should," he replied. "For tonight." His voice carried a furtive authority he had not meant to use. He sat back and let the room swallow the weight of it. The children shifted, and the older of the two half awoke, blinking as if emerging from a silver fog. The smaller one snuggled, seeking a warmth that was both physical and someone's attention. The older child's eyelids fluttered and then closed, the body easing as if into acceptance. The wooden horse made a faint wooden scrape against the pallet where it was tucked. The prince watched the maid's hands as she straightened the blanket and smoothed hair that had escaped the braid's pattern. There was an intimacy to the gesture that had nothing to do with sentimentality, only necessity and love given in small, precise doings. The distance between them measured itself in manners and history, but between hands and hands there was a less politic counting. He found himself almost reaching. The impulse to lay his hand over hers was quick and bewildering. He imagined the touch as both a promise and a confession. He imagined, more embarrassingly, that a brush of fingers could recalibrate years. He stopped himself mid-motion and let the fingers curl into his palm instead, as if holding a secret inside rather than offering it. The act felt both cowardly and wise. She noticed the movement anyway. Her eyes rested on his hand and then rose to his face. For the first time since he had entered, there was a point when their gazes met, and neither softened nor hardened but held. Something like recognition passed across the small field between them, an insistence that each was a person with a life that could be touched, not a function of a role. The recognition was brief, and its brevity made it bright. "Do you have a name?" he asked suddenly, with a boldness that surprised him. The question was not about labels. It was rather the only honest way he could attempt to cross the ritualized gap between them in language, rather than in an act that might terrify her with its impropriety. She hesitated, then smiled in a manner that was not for show. "You may call me what you will in this room," she answered. "Outside they have other names for me." There was a humor there, dry as toast, that did not pretend sweetness. He allowed himself to keep that small gift. The kettle clicked as the heat of the hearth found a new accord. The candle on the table burned down an inch more and then another. Time moved in increments smaller than his habitual appointments, and yet richer for their scarcity. The prince felt his watchful walls grow thinner. He felt something pliant take shape where iron had lain. But even as the room pulled around them like a small private world, a thread of reality tugged insistently at the edges. The city outside did not forget the palace. Rumor moved faster than truth and with less scruple. The prince had the sensation, sudden and sharp, that this night, this house, was a place where the palace's pen might yet scratch. He rose to leave only to be detained by a softer motion. The maid had stepped beside him and placed something in his hand without any flourish. It was a scrap of paper, yellowed, with ink faded to a polite gray, a note perhaps, or a dried page from a ledger. The prince turned it over. On it, in a cramped, careful hand, was written a name he did not know and would not, in that moment, use aloud. Before he could speak either acceptance or refusal, before he could decide whether to fold the paper into his pocket or burn it in the fire for the privacy of the night, a sound struck the room. A knock at the door that cut the air like a knife through fabric, deliberate, firm, and not the soft, tentative rap of a neighbor with gossip, but a knock that bore official weight. The knock came again, louder this time, and the frail wooden door trembled on its hinges. The candle flame shuddered. The maid's face went pale, her hand freezing where it rested on the back of the chair. Her eyes darted to the pallet, to the sleeping children, then to him. Without a word, she lifted her hand slightly, an unspoken plea for silence. The prince moved quickly, instinct overriding hesitation. He crossed to the far corner of the room where the shadows gathered thick, beyond the firelight's reach. He pressed himself into the darkness, cloak drawn close, his breath held low. The faint crackle of the hearth covered the sound of his boots against the floorboards. The maid gathered herself. She smoothed her dress with both hands, forcing composure into her bearing. She walked slowly to the door, though her steps faltered once, and rested her hand on the latch. For a moment, she leaned her forehead against the wood, as though measuring strength against what waited outside. Then she opened it. A neighbor stood on the threshold, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her bonnet dripping from the night mist. Her eyes were quick and searching, darting into the room over the maid's shoulder. "I saw light late," the woman said in a low, insistent voice. "Thought to see if all was well." The maid drew herself up with quiet dignity, blocking the view with her body. "We are well enough." Her voice was even, though thin. "The children are asleep. You will wake them if you raise your tone." The neighbor glanced again, narrowing her eyes as though catching a shift of shadow within. "Strange," she said. "Strange for you to burn more than a single candle at this hour, with the price of tallow what it is." Her suspicion was sharp, but coated in a neighbor's concern. The maid offered a tight smile. "I had a bit left from last week. I thought to use it before it wasted away." She leaned against the doorframe with casual insistence, her posture a barrier. "But thank you. Truly. We are safe." The woman did not leave at once. Her gaze moved once more to the gloom behind the maid, where the prince waited in the silent dark. The air felt charged with the danger of recognition. Then, with a slight shake of her head, the neighbor muttered, "Best not to waste what you cannot replace." She adjusted her shawl, pulled it tighter, and stepped back into the street. The maid closed the door firmly, pressing her palm against it until the sound of footsteps faded. Her shoulders sagged for an instant, but then she drew herself upright, aware that she was no longer alone. Slowly, she turned toward the corner. The prince stepped forward from the shadows, the firelight catching on his profile. His jaw was set, his expression unreadable. He had stood in council chambers where lords argued over kingdoms and borders, but he had not felt the same tight pull in his chest that he felt now, in this one-room dwelling. "She suspected," he said quietly. "She always suspects," the maid replied. Her voice was dry, worn, almost resigned. She brushed her hands against her skirt, restless, though her eyes never left him. "And she will speak of it. Words spread faster than fire where walls are thin." He studied her carefully. The way she straightened herself, even now, as if to shield not only her children but the very dignity of her home, the thinness of her wrists, the determined line of her chin, the quiet flame in her eyes. A woman who had been cast aside, yet still fought with silence instead of surrender. "I cannot leave you like this," he said suddenly. The words left his mouth with a force that startled even him. She flinched, almost imperceptibly. "You must." "No." He stepped closer, his voice low, urgent. "I cannot." He gestured faintly toward the children. "They cannot." Her eyes closed briefly, as if to hold back a rush of words. When she opened them, there was iron in her gaze. "Do you think pity feeds them? Do you think your presence here does not put us all at greater risk? If they learn you were seen in this house—" She broke off, pressing her lips tightly together. His chest rose and fell, heavy. He wanted to speak, to argue, to insist. But he knew enough to hear the truth in her warning. His presence endangered her, yet leaving felt like a betrayal. The conflict made his silence heavier than any words could be. The fire popped, sending a small spray of sparks onto the hearth. The maid bent quickly, brushing them aside before they could catch. Her hand trembled as she worked, but her movements were controlled. She rose again, the candlelight outlining her face. He took a step toward her. The air between them thickened. She drew in a breath but did not retreat. For a moment, the fragile world of the room balanced on the space between them. His resolve, her fear, and the dangerous intimacy of a truth neither dared name. "You cannot stay," she whispered. "You cannot be left," he answered. The words hovered, a fragile chain forged in the low firelight. Neither moved, neither surrendered. Outside, the wind scraped against the shutters with a lonely moan, as though the street itself conspired to listen. The children stirred under the blanket, one rolling closer to the other. The small horse clattered softly against the boards. The sound was a reminder of innocence, of how much was at stake. The maid tore her gaze from him and bent once more to adjust the blanket, smoothing it over thin shoulders. The prince watched her, his fists tight at his sides. The sense of powerlessness pressed against him like an iron door. He had been raised to believe that rank and command could bend the world. Here, in this house, the world refused to bend. When she rose again, she spoke without looking at him. "You should go before more knocks come." His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "And if they do?" She gave a short, humorless laugh. "Then I will tell them I burn candles too late at night. That is the truth they already half believe." She paused. Her shoulders stiffened. "But if they see you?" He knew the rest. His presence would not be interpreted as charity. It would be a scandal, an offense, an unforgivable trespass of rank. The maid and her children would be swallowed whole by the gossip. He would be dragged before his mother, forced into explanations he could not give. The kettle rattled faintly on the hearth, as if urging an answer. He exhaled, long and hard, as though the air itself resisted his chest. "I could take you from here," he said, the words raw. Her head snapped toward him. Her expression was a mixture of disbelief, alarm, and a flicker of something else that vanished too quickly to be read. "Do you hear yourself?" she asked softly. "Do you understand what that would mean?" "Yes," he said, though his own certainty faltered at the edges. "I understand only that I cannot walk out of this room and leave you in such misery." She stared at him, breathing shallowly. The firelight glowed on her face, highlighting the hollows of her cheeks, the determined line of her jaw. She did not speak. The silence itself was a verdict, though unreadable. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing inward. The prince took another step toward her, the floorboard creaking beneath his boot. The sound echoed in the small room, as if even the wood wished to remind him of the risk. He stopped, every nerve tight with restraint. Her eyes met his again, unflinching now. For a moment, it felt as though they stood on opposite sides of a chasm, both knowing that a single step could bridge it or destroy them both. Then the silence shattered. Outside, the unmistakable rumble of wheels rolled over the cobblestones. Hooves clattered in rhythm, closer, louder, until they halted just beyond the broken shutters. The maid's hand flew to her mouth. The prince's heart lurched against his ribs. The room was suddenly thick with dread. A carriage had stopped in the street. The rattle of the wheels ceased with a final groan of wood and iron. The horses stamped, snorted, the clink of their harnesses ringing sharp in the narrow street. The sound bled through the cracks in the shutters and made the room feel suddenly smaller, as if the house itself braced for intrusion. The maid froze, her hand still pressed against her lips. The prince turned his head toward the window, every muscle drawn taut, listening. The children slept on, oblivious, their shallow breaths filling the silence like a fragile thread. A man's voice called out, muffled by the walls, low but authoritative, the kind of tone used by those who expected to be answered. The maid's eyes darted to the prince. Fear, sharp and clear, leapt across her face. "You must not be seen here," she whispered, her voice tight with urgency. He moved instantly. His gaze swept the room, searching for cover. There was no space grand enough to conceal a man of his stature, but necessity erased hesitation. He pulled the heavy cloak tighter around him and slid toward the darker recess near the cupboard, where the wall met the shadows. He stood still, heart beating in his throat. The maid pressed her palms against her skirt, forcing steadiness. She took one breath, then another, and went to the door. Her hand paused on the latch. Her knuckles whitened. She opened it slowly. The lantern light from outside spilled into the room, carving long lines across the floorboards. Two figures stood beyond the threshold. A coachman with reins looped over his arm, and beside him, a man in dark livery, his collar stiff, his bearing formal. The seal on his coat glinted briefly in the lantern light. "Madam," the liveried man said, his eyes sweeping over her quickly. "Forgive the hour. I was sent to deliver a message." His voice was polished, measured, the kind used by servants of authority who carry weight, not their own. The maid inclined her head slightly. "A message?" "Yes, for you." He drew a folded paper from his coat and extended it. His glance shifted to the interior of the house, probing, though the doorframe and her body blocked the view. She accepted the paper with steady hands, though her breath faltered. "Who sends it?" The man gave a tight, professional bow. "It is not my place to say. Only that it is to be placed in your keeping and answered in thought if not in word." Her fingers curled around the paper. For a moment she stood unmoving, as if the weight of it had grown beyond reason. "I understand," she murmured. The man's eyes lingered a second longer, as though listening for a sound within. Then he stepped back, signaling to the coachman. "A good night to you," he said, his tone firm, final. The coachman flicked the reins, the carriage jolted forward, and the wheels began their slow roll down the cobbled lane. The horses' hooves faded, leaving only the echo of suspicion behind. The maid closed the door and leaned her forehead against the wood, her hands trembling around the folded paper. For a long moment she stood that way, her breath uneven. From the shadows, the prince emerged. His cloak hung heavy around him, his face drawn. "Who was he?" he asked softly. She shook her head, lowering the paper. "Someone who carries words for others, that is all." She moved to the table, setting the paper down without opening it, as though to open it would invite danger inside. The prince's eyes never left her. "And you?" Will you read it? Her gaze flickered toward the children, then back to him. I cannot, she said. Not while you stand here. If the words are poison, better that I drink them alone. The remark struck him with quiet force. He stepped closer, the boards creaking faintly under his boots. You should not bear this alone. If it concerns you, it concerns me. Her laugh was brittle, a thread of sound that snapped as soon as it was made. You say that now, here, in the dark. But when the light comes, when others see, what then? Concern will turn into silence, and silence into safety for you, but not for me. He stood very near her now, the table between them, the candlelight touching both their faces. The folded paper lay untouched on the wood, like a small weapon waiting to be drawn. He reached out, his hand hovering just above it, but he did not touch. Then let me share the danger. It is not yours alone. She stared at him, her expression taut with disbelief and something more fragile beneath. For a moment, the world seemed balanced between confession and denial. Then she closed her eyes and pushed the paper toward him with a trembling hand. If you wish to bear it, then open it. But do not pretend you will not regret what it says. The prince's breath deepened. Slowly, deliberately, he unfolded the paper. The candlelight caught on the ink, though the words themselves were spare. His brow furrowed as he read. Whatever was written, it was brief, no more than a sentence, but it carried enough weight to pale his face. What does it say? She asked, her voice low, almost pleading. He looked at her. For a heartbeat, he said nothing. His lips parted, then closed again. His silence stretched, her hands clenched at her sides. Tell me. He let out the breath he had been holding. It says you are being watched. Her face drained of color. The words fell like stones in the room, sinking into every corner. She glanced to the shuttered window, to the door, to the cracks where the night still pressed in. Her body stiffened, as though expecting hands to reach through the walls. And still you think you can remain here? He asked. His voice was low, urgent, edged with fear he rarely showed. Do you not see what this means? Someone already knows. Someone has already spoken. She straightened slowly, forcing steel into her spine. And what would you have me do? She asked. Where can I go with 2 children and no coin? Where can I go that their eyes would not follow? He wanted to answer. He wanted to say anywhere, to swear he would carry her himself if he must. But the words caught in his throat, bound by the knowledge of what such a promise meant. The fire spat and settled, the candle guttered, its flame bending low. The silence between them stretched taut again, heavy with all the words unsaid. Finally, she reached for the paper, crumpled it once in her hand, then smoothed it flat again. Better to know I am watched than to wonder. She set it back on the table, her hand lingering on it for a moment longer, as if daring it to change. He studied her face. Beneath the fear was something unbreakable, a quiet resolve that demanded respect. He felt the pull of it, the dangerous gravity of admiration. You do not deserve this, he said quietly. No one deserves it, she replied. But some of us must live it. Her eyes met his, steady now. And some of us must leave before they are seen standing in the wrong place. His heart thudded. Every part of him resisted her meaning. His hands curled into fists against the table. I cannot leave you like this, he said again, the same vow that had haunted the night. Her voice lowered, fierce and trembling. And if you stay, what becomes of us? The question sliced through the room, leaving only the sound of the fire's faint crackle. Before either could speak again, before the answer could be forced into words, the sound came once more. The heavy roll of wheels, nearer this time, halting with deliberate weight before the house. The carriage had returned. The second arrival was different from the first. The wheels ground to a halt with a heavier weight, the horses restless, their snorts steaming into the night air. The very boards beneath their feet seemed to tremble. Lantern light spilled through the thin cracks of the shutters, brighter than before, as though this carriage carried more than a messenger. The maid's breath caught in her throat. She moved instinctively toward the pallet, her body angled to shield the children even in their sleep. Her hand pressed lightly on one small shoulder, steadying her courage through the fragile weight of it. The prince was already on his feet, every nerve braced, his instincts sharpened to a soldier's clarity, though he had never been trained for battle in this manner. His eyes darted to the door, then to her, then back to the window where the faint glow of lanterns shifted. The thought of being discovered here, in this house, crashed against his chest like a tide. Then came the sound of boots on cobblestones, deliberate, measured, too many to be dismissed as mere travelers. The prince's hand tightened against the edge of the table, as if bracing himself not against an enemy, but against the inevitability of what would come if those boots entered the house. "Stay back," the maid whispered to him, her eyes wide, voice low but sharp. "Do not move unless you must." The words were not command but plea, carrying in them the raw fear of a woman who knew how quickly suspicion could ignite into ruin. She straightened her shoulders, smoothed her hair with trembling hands, and forced herself toward the door again. A knock, this one heavier, resonant, meant to summon rather than inquire. The wood rattled, and the children stirred faintly beneath the blanket, one letting out a drowsy murmur before slipping back into uneasy sleep. The maid opened the door slowly, her body forming the narrowest of barriers. On the threshold stood no neighbor, no courier. A tall figure loomed in dark garments, his cloak broad, his expression sharpened by the authority of long habit. His gaze fell first upon her, measuring, then swept the dim interior of the house. Behind him, a pair of lanterns swayed, carried by attendants who stood a respectful pace back, but with watchful eyes. "Forgive the hour," the man said, his voice even, though the weight of command lay beneath it. "I was instructed to inquire into a matter of concern in this district." The maid's grip on the doorframe tightened until her knuckles whitened. "At this hour?" she asked carefully. "Concern does not measure time," the man replied. His gaze lingered on the faint light of the hearth behind her. "It was reported that unusual company was seen in this quarter tonight. I was sent to confirm the truth of it." Her chest rose and fell, once, twice. She felt the prince's presence behind her without turning. "This is a poor house," she said. "We have no company. Only the fire to warm us and 2 children to feed." The man's eyes sharpened, studying her face. Silence stretched, thick as smoke. Then he inclined his head slightly. "If that is so, then you will not object to my stepping inside a moment." The words hung between them. The maid's body stiffened, every instinct resisting. But refusal was dangerous. Refusal implied secrecy, and secrecy drew questions sharper than any blade. She shifted aside, her movements controlled, each one measured. "Come then," she said softly. The man stepped over the threshold, his boots loud against the weary boards. His eyes swept the room with the quickness of one trained to read spaces. The candlelight glinted on the brass buttons of his coat. He glanced at the hearth, at the pallet where 2 small bodies lay beneath a thin blanket, at the table with its meager remains of food. His gaze lingered, faintly suspicious, on the single cloak still damp with night air hung by the door. The prince pressed deeper into the shadows, breath measured, his stillness absolute. His body leaned into the dark corner where the cupboard met the wall, hoping the angle and the dimness would cloak him. He had hidden from enemies in war games, from courtiers in childhood escapades, but never from the eyes of his mother's men, and never with stakes this high. The maid followed the man's gaze deliberately, speaking before he could frame his suspicions. "That cloak belonged to my husband," she said quietly. "He has been gone 2 winters now, but I cannot part with it. It keeps out the drafts when the nights are cruel." The man's expression did not change, but his eyes flicked to her with a glimmer of interest, perhaps doubt, perhaps respect. "I see," he said at last. He moved a step closer to the table, the boards groaning under his weight. His fingers brushed the folded scrap of paper still resting there. The maid's breath caught. "You keep letters?" the man asked. "Old things," she answered quickly. "Words that no longer matter, but I cannot throw them to the wind. They are scraps of memory. And memories cost nothing." The man's brow furrowed, but he did not unfold the paper. He set it down again, the gesture deliberate. His eyes lifted to hers. "You understand, of course, that these streets are watched. Too often the poor harbor those who should not be here, those who do not belong." Her throat tightened, but her voice held steady. "We harbor no one but ourselves." The words lingered in the air, their double edge sharp as glass. The man let the silence stretch. He looked toward the pallet where the children slept, their faces pale in the firelight, their breaths shallow but even. Something softened in his gaze, though his posture remained unyielding. He turned back toward the door. "You would do well to remember," he said, his voice lower now, almost confidential, "that a house this small cannot hide a secret. Walls listen, streets speak. If company comes, it will not remain unseen." The maid inclined her head, her hand pressed against the doorframe. "I understand." The man stepped outside, his cloak sweeping after him. The lantern-bearers turned as one, the carriage wheels creaking as the horses were urged forward. Slowly, the sound of hooves and iron faded into the distance once more. For a long time, she did not move. The door remained half open, the night spilling in with its damp breath. At last she closed it, gently this time, and rested her head against the wood. Her hands shook, though she forced them still before she turned. The prince stepped out of the shadows. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a restrained fury. He looked at her as though she had just pulled him from a precipice. "You lied for me," he said quietly. "I told the only truth that would keep us breathing," she replied. Her voice trembled now, though her words were steady. "If he had looked closer—" She broke off, pressing her hand to her lips. He moved closer, stopping only a breath away, his voice low, fierce. "I cannot let this continue. You are in danger because of me. Because I came here." Her eyes lifted to his, filled with both defiance and something more fragile beneath. "And yet you did come. And still you remain." The silence between them quivered like a drawn bowstring. Neither stepped back. The fire burned low, the shadows deepened, and the weight of what had just passed pressed against them like a hand that would not release. Outside, the last echo of hooves faded. Inside, the world hung by a thread. The prince drew in a slow, deliberate breath. His next words came not as a question, but as a vow. "I will not abandon you to this." And even as the certainty left his mouth, the sound of hurried steps echoed once more outside the door, louder, closer, stopping directly before the threshold. A voice called firmly into the night air, demanding entry. The knock was sharp, decisive, a command rather than a request. The boards shivered under its force. The maid flinched, her breath catching audibly in the silence that followed. Her hand flew instinctively toward the pallet, fingers brushing the children's blanket as if to shield them from what waited outside. The prince's jaw tightened. He had no time for hesitation. In 2 strides he was beside her, his voice low, urgent. "Do not open unless you must." Her eyes met his. The terror there was real, but so too was the steady core beneath it. "If I do not," she whispered, "they will break it down, and then all is lost." The knock came again, firmer, echoing in the small room. The prince moved swiftly back into the shadows, pressing himself against the corner, cloak drawn close. The maid forced her trembling hands into stillness and went to the door. When she opened it, a figure filled the threshold. Not the dark-coated officer of before, but a royal envoy, livery unmistakable even in the dim light. His posture was rigid, his eyes hard, his voice clipped and official. "By order of Her Majesty," he said, "you are summoned to present yourself at the palace, immediately." The words fell like a verdict. The maid's body stiffened. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She cast a quick glance behind her toward the children, then lowered her gaze again as though willing her face to remain calm. "My children," she began. "They will be provided for," the envoy interrupted, his tone impersonal. "This summons admits no delay." His gaze swept over her with the practiced coldness of one accustomed to obedience. "Do not force me to fetch you by less courteous means." She gripped the edge of the door, knuckles white, her body a barrier against what lay behind her. For a moment it seemed she might refuse. Then she straightened, drawing her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "I will come," she said softly. The envoy inclined his head, a gesture more mechanical than respectful. "You will follow the carriage." He stepped back, signaling to the men behind him. Two figures shifted in the shadows, lanterns swaying. The horses stamped impatiently, their harnesses clinking. The maid turned, her eyes sweeping the room one last time. They lingered on the children, still sleeping beneath the blanket. Her lips trembled as she bent and brushed a hand over their hair, murmuring words too soft for anyone but them to hear. She drew the blanket higher around their shoulders, as though that thin fabric could shield them in her absence. The prince remained in the corner, rigid, his body tense with the force of restraint. Every fiber of him wanted to step forward, to tear the summons from her hand, to declare himself. But he knew with a crushing clarity, that to reveal himself now would ruin her entirely. He clenched his fists until his nails bit into his palms. When she straightened, she caught his eye for a fleeting instant. Her gaze held 1,000 unsaid words: fear, apology, defiance, and something more fragile, a plea for strength. He gave her nothing but the tight nod of a man who promised silently he would not abandon her, though silence was the only vow he could offer. She turned back to the envoy. "Give me a moment to make ready," she said. The man allowed it with a curt nod. She moved to the table, took the folded paper lying there, and slipped it into her shawl. Then she lifted the little wooden horse from the pallet, prying it gently from her son's small hand. He stirred but did not wake. She held the toy for a long second, then placed it carefully back beneath his fingers, as though leaving behind a piece of herself. The envoy cleared his throat. "It is time." She nodded once, her chin high now, dignity held like armor. She stepped out into the night. The envoy followed, lantern light glinting on his buttons. The carriage door opened with a creak, waiting. Inside the house, silence rushed in behind her like a tide. The prince stood motionless, his body taut, the image of her retreating figure carved into his chest. The fire hissed, a log collapsing into embers, and the children shifted restlessly in their sleep, unaware that their world had just been wrenched open. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and reached the door. His hand gripped the latch, but he did not pull it open. He could not. To step outside now was to expose them both, to undo what her composure had bought. He pressed his forehead against the cool wood, his breath hard, his heart striking like a hammer. From the street, the sound of hooves echoed, followed by the slam of the carriage door. The wheels began to roll. Slowly, inexorably, the noise faded into the night. The prince turned back into the room, the hollow silence pressing against him. His eyes fell on the pallet, on the 2 small figures curled together beneath the blanket. The wooden horse gleamed faintly in the firelight, its worn surface polished by years of desperate touch. He stepped closer, staring down at the children, then closed his eyes. A vow formed in the marrow of his bones, wordless but absolute. He would not let her face this summons alone. But even as the promise tightened within him, another sound broke the silence. A heavy step outside, slower than the envoy's, deliberate, pausing directly before the door, as if someone else had chosen to remain behind. The step outside was deliberate, heavy, and it did not move away. It lingered on the threshold, a presence waiting to be acknowledged. The prince held his breath, every muscle rigid, his hand still gripping the latch as if ready to bar the door against intrusion. A pause. Then a voice, low and commanding, carried through the wood. "Open, by order of the crown." The words struck with a chill sharper than any winter air. He closed his eyes briefly, the weight of inevitability pressing hard. The children stirred faintly, murmuring in their sleep. He looked once toward them, then forced his hand to loosen the latch. With a controlled motion, he opened the door. Lantern light spilled into the house again, washing across the floorboards. The man who had remained behind was tall, cloaked, his bearing unmistakably official. His eyes narrowed when they met the prince's face. For a heartbeat, silence roared between them. "Your Highness," the man said at last, his tone carefully restrained, "you should not be here." The prince did not flinch, and yet, here I am. The man's gaze flicked to the pallet, to the sleeping children, to the remnants of poverty that filled the room. His jaw tightened, but he spoke with formality. "The Queen must be told. Your presence in this house compromises everything." The prince stepped forward, his voice low, deliberate. "You will tell her nothing." The man's expression shifted, torn between duty and the shock of defiance. "I serve the crown," he said. "So do I," the prince replied, his words edged with steel. "And tonight, you will serve it by silence." The air between them thickened. The envoy's lips parted as if to protest, but he faltered under the prince's unyielding gaze. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. At last, with a stiff bow, the man turned on his heel and stepped back into the street. Lantern light wavered as he disappeared into the darkness. The prince closed the door with careful hands. His body trembled, not with fear, but with the magnitude of what had just passed. He leaned against the wood, drawing a long breath, then turned back to the small room. The children had settled again, the faint rise and fall of their chests steady under the blanket. The wooden horse rested between them, its surface gleaming faintly in the firelight. He stood over them for a long moment, the quiet rhythm of their sleep pressing against the turmoil inside him. At last he turned toward the table, where the candle burned low. He dropped into the chair, burying his face briefly in his hands. The image of the maid being led into the carriage replayed itself again and again, each detail carving deeper into him. The way she had looked back, the fragile dignity in her bearing, the quiet plea in her eyes. He lifted his head, staring at the crumpled paper still on the table. The words echoed in his mind. "You are being watched." The truth of it had arrived with iron boots and lanterns. He knew what waited in the palace. He knew what her presence there would mean. The room pressed in on him, heavy with smoke and silence. He could not stay. He could not leave. Every choice seemed ruinous, yet inaction was worse. He rose again, restless, pacing the narrow boards. His cloak brushed against the walls. Then, the sound of hooves, not distant this time, not rolling away, but near, too near. He froze, his pulse hammering. He moved swiftly to the window, peering through the broken shutter. What he saw made his breath stop. The Queen's carriage, unmistakable in its grandeur even beneath the dim lanterns, had arrived at the end of the street. The Queen's carriage moved with grave inevitability, its wheels grinding against the uneven stones, the lanterns throwing long shadows that bent against the narrow houses. The gilded crest caught what little light there was, shimmering like a brand upon the night. The prince stood rigid at the window, watching it come to a stop. His breath shallowed, his body bracing as though struck. He turned back toward the children. They slept on, untouched by the weight of what was descending upon their small world. The wooden horse rested between them, its edges worn smooth by desperate hands. He lingered there for a moment, drawn by their innocence, by the fragile trust of their slumber. Then he straightened, pulling his cloak about him, and crossed the room. He paused at the door, his palm pressed flat against the wood. He could hear the muffled voices outside, the shuffle of attendants, the precise sound of boots forming an escort. The Queen had not come alone. She never did. He opened the door. The night air struck him cool and sharp. The street was lined with figures in livery, their lanterns steady, their posture unyielding. At the center, descending from the carriage with a composure born of years of rule, was the Queen. She was clothed in dark silk, the sheen of it catching the light, her veil lifted back to reveal a face carved in stern resolve. Their eyes met across the space. Hers held no surprise, no fury, only certainty. "Son!" Her voice was low, commanding, every syllable controlled. "You are far from where you should be." He bowed his head slightly, though the gesture carried defiance. "I am exactly where I must be." The Queen stepped forward, the lantern light framing her as she moved. She stopped just before him, her gaze unwavering. "This house, these streets, these walls, none of them belong to you. You endanger yourself. You endanger the crown. And if the crown cannot bear truth?" His words came sharp, his restraint cracking. "What is it worth?" Her eyes flickered, a trace of steel flashing there. "The crown is worth everything, and it is weakened by the company you keep." He held her gaze, unblinking. "If it is weakened by compassion, then perhaps it was never strong." The Queen inhaled slowly, her expression tightening. Around them, the attendants shifted uneasily, the silence of the street growing taut. At last, she turned her head slightly, glancing toward the house. "She has been brought before me. She is under my charge now. The matter is no longer yours to direct." His jaw clenched. "It has always been mine." The Queen studied him for a long moment. Then her voice softened, though the iron beneath it did not vanish. "You are heir to a kingdom. You cannot make yourself heir to her burdens as well." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only she might hear. "If I do not, then I am unworthy of either. You ask me to be sovereign of a people I cannot even dare to touch. And yet, here in this house, I have touched truth." Her lips pressed together, the faintest flicker of something unspoken in her eyes. She straightened, her authority returning in full measure. "You will return to the palace with me. This conversation cannot be held in the street." The prince looked back once more toward the window. Inside, faint candlelight touched the children's faces, unknowing, trusting. His heart clenched with the silent vow he had already made. He turned back to his mother, and for the first time in years, his voice held not deference, but finality. "I will return," he said, "but not to surrender, to choose." The Queen's eyes narrowed, studying him, but she gave no reply. She turned, ascending into the carriage once more. The attendants closed ranks, their lanterns swaying as the procession readied itself to depart. The prince remained still for a moment, the night air cool against his face, the weight of what lay ahead pressing hard upon him. He looked once more toward the crooked house, its window glowing faintly in the dark. Then he gathered his cloak about him and stepped forward, his stride deliberate, each footfall carrying him closer to the choice he had sworn to make. The carriage door closed. The wheels began to turn. The prince followed, not as a man dragged into obedience, but as one walking into the heart of his own defiance. The night closed behind them, leaving the poor lane silent once more, the children sleeping in their fragile peace, unaware that the world beyond their door had shifted forever. Dawn bled into the palace like a stern correction. The corridors were washed in a cold, pearly light. Servants moved in silence, eyes lowered, the echo of their steps swallowed by stone. The prince walked between them with a steadiness that felt earned in the space of a single night. Every inch of the way, he could feel the old instruction pressing on his shoulders: defer, preserve, perform. But it slid like water from wax. He turned at the last passage and entered the great hall. The Queen was already there. She sat upright beneath the high windows, a dark figure framed by pale mourning. No music, no decorations softened the hall, only the hush of power at rest. A narrow line of courtiers ringed the room at a prudent distance, their expressions composed into attentive neutrality. The prince did not look at them. He looked only at the woman who had shaped his spine since he could stand. "Your Highness," she said, not rising. The address balanced on the fine line between mother and monarch. "You are early." "I am late," he answered, his voice carrying, steady. "I should have stood here years ago." A flicker crossed her eyes, irritation, curiosity, fear, gone at once. "We will have no theatre," she murmured. "Speak plainly." He took another step, then another, until the dark veining in the marble at his feet felt like a map he had been meant to follow. He stopped where his words could not be missed. "Bring her in," he said. The queen's stillness sharpened. Around the walls, shoulders tensed. The command might have been a plea, but he had made certain it wasn't. The queen tipped her chin a fraction, and a chamberlain vanished through a side door. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. They waited. The prince forced his hands open at his sides. He remembered the door in Stave Lane, the thin broth scent, the way the blanket fell from a child's shoulder, the small horse warm in a sleeping hand. He kept those images where he could reach for courage. He kept his jaw relaxed. He looked at his mother and let her see all the words he would not couch in diplomacy. The side door parted. She entered. No finery had been thrust upon her. She wore the same plain dress, shawl drawn close, hair smoothed in a way that tried to hide the night's unrest and failed by a lock or two. She paused at the threshold, pupils narrowing against the sudden light, and in that beat he saw her swallow down the instinct to retreat. She walked forward with small, exact steps, a woman measuring the distance between humiliation and survival, and choosing to place her foot on dignity anyway. They did not look at one another at first. She kept her eyes on the queen's dais, then lowered them as taught by years in service. He stood as if anchored. He did not move to meet her. To do so would be to claim before he had spoken. He would not use his body to take what his words must offer openly. The queen regarded her, expression unreadable. "You were summoned last night," she said. "You are here under my protection." She let the phrase sit between them. Protection could be a hand or a leash. The maid's voice came low, level. "I came when called." "And you were visited," the queen continued, "by my son." Beneath the shawl, a flinch lived and died. She did not deny it. "He came." "Why?" The prince answered before the maid could be forced to explain herself to a tribunal she did not deserve. "Because I could not pretend I did not hear," he said, each syllable clean. "Because I did not wish to be king over hunger I never saw." The queen's gaze slid to him. "And what is it you think you saw?" "A woman I wronged by my absence," he said. "And children this house has starved of warmth and name." Her lips thinned at the word name. It had been placed deliberately. He felt the ripple of it in the room. He held his ground. "You endanger us all speaking like this," she said softly. "You make a spectacle of—" "I will make a change," he cut in, not loud, not insolent, only immovable. "If I cannot, then I have no business wearing the cloak you gave me." One of the courtiers shifted, a faint stir like a bird unsettling on its perch. The queen's head turned a fraction. The room froze again. The prince looked past her then, over her shoulder, beyond the throne, to the door by which the maid had entered. He let his eyes find her. It was an act of war, and it was an act of mercy. The thread between them pulled tight and quiet as a harp string. Her face had no court polish to protect it. Fear lived there, and shame's aftershadow, but also the stubborn light that had lit a poor room for years. He had not known he could read anyone so clearly. Perhaps he had never tried. He spoke to his mother, but he let his gaze rest on the woman who had made him come to life. "Do not ask me to deny compassion," he said. "Do not ask me to be a prince only where it requires nothing." The queen's hand, resting on the arm of her chair, stilled. "What is it you want?" He could have said everything and meant only one thing. He made himself earn it in small words. "I want her name restored to decency," he said. "I want her children fed and warmed. I want to walk beside her in daylight without making her a scandal told over cups." The hall received this like a blow muffled by velvet. A waver spread through the bodies curated along the walls. The queen's breath drew slow. "And if I refuse?" she asked. He did not smile. His voice gentled. "Then I will refuse with you," he said. "I will not go where you send me. I will not speak the words you give me. I will not marry the stranger you choose to patch a treaty I did not break." He let the risk of it sit in his sternum and did not lower his eyes. "You know I can hold a line when I must." The old knowledge of him, his stubbornness that had once been a child's tantrum, later a soldier's strength, moved across her face like a weather pattern. She shifted in her chair, then rose. The simple act changed the room. Every head bowed a fraction deeper. The prince did not. He watched his mother approach the edge of her throne, the fabric of her gown whispering over the riser. She addressed the maid with a tone that had calmed riots. "You stand in a dangerous place," she said. "People will make you into what suits their story. They will call you usurper, temptress, thief. They will throw names faster than bread. You will be cold under them. You will be bruised." The maid kept her eyes down. Her hands folded over her shawl, pressing the crumpled edge where, somewhere, a thin piece of paper lay hidden. The queen's words did not surprise her. She had worn them already, in the dark, without witnesses. The queen looked back at her son. "Is this what you choose? To take a woman from a poor lane and make her bear the weight of your defiance?" "No," he said, the word tethered to something clean. "I choose to stand between her and that weight with everything I am." Silence settled in a new way. It had more shape to it, less fear. He stepped forward one pace and then stopped, awaiting the smallest sign. He would not reach for her without permission. The maid lifted her head. For the first time in this hall, she took in his full height, the particular way he had chosen to stand, unguarded and unadorned. She took in the queen, the courtiers, the long windows combing light down on them all. She looked at her own hands, at the threadbare shawl folded over them. The choice was not hers, and yet it was. That was the cruelty of it. That was also the path through. She answered the question no one had spoken to her. "I do not want to be a story," she said softly. "I want to be a person." The queen exhaled. It was not surrender. It might have been recognition. She looked at her son. "What will you give up?" He did not hesitate. "Anything that is not worthy of her." In the far rank, a throat cleared. On some other morning the prince would have been sent out, so that arrangements could be made to harvest his brave sentiment and graft it onto something useful. Not today. He did not take his eyes from the queen. "You believe compassion is strength," she said. "Prove it. Take the whispers and bend them into silence." She turned slightly, sweeping the room. "Let it be recorded that the crown does not punish loyalty to the least of its own." The prince's heart stuttered once. It was not the full benediction. It was a door opening the width of a hand. He nodded once, a bow of a different kind, and looked to the woman whose answer mattered more than any document. He stepped toward her. The space between them was a frail bridge made of choices. He stopped an arm's length away and lifted his hand a little, then let it fall, then lifted it again. Ceremony had rules. This moment had only conscience. "May I?" he asked. Her pulse fluttered at her throat. She did not quite smile. "If you mean to take my hand," she said, the faintest thread of humor passing through fear like sun through cloud. "It should be now, while I am still brave." Laughter did not break the hall, but something eased. He reached, palm up, the offer plain. She placed her hand in his. Warm skin met warm skin. It was nothing more than that, and it was everything. His thumb, unthinking, barely moved against the side of her hand, a promise without words. She did not pull away. Her shoulders dropped their defensive angle by a breath. He turned with her toward the Queen, their joined hands disclosed like a petition. "I will establish her household under my protection," he said, voice clear. "I will see her children housed and tended before this day is done, and I will not hide." The Queen's gaze fell to their hands. She did not lower it further. "Then you will live with the sight of it," she said, cool and inexorable. "Every day, every room. You will answer for it in councils and over maps, and in winter when bread runs thin and the poor ask you to choose again." "I will," he said. "I have begun." The hall, which had been a machine for judgment, discovered itself to be a place where something like mercy could be engineered. A chamberlain, unbidden, stepped forward with a slight inclination of the head, ready to carry instructions that might for once save rather than soften damage. The Queen raised one hand, and he stopped where he was, awaiting the shape of the command. She looked to the maid. "Do you understand what you consent to?" The maid held the prince's hand more firmly. "I understand that my children will be warmed," she said. "I understand that his presence will not be a shadow I must hide from them." "And the talk?" the Queen asked. "It will not stop tomorrow." "It has never stopped," the maid answered. "I have learned to live while it goes on." A long beat. Then the Queen's shoulders eased a degree. "Then so be it," she said. "Let it be known that the woman once dismissed from service will be restored to the household, not as servant, but as its ward. Her children to be provided for under the Crown's protection. Whoever speaks against their care will answer for it." A new sound moved through the hall. It was not applause. It was not relief. It was something like breath returning to bodies that had held it too long. The prince bowed his head to his mother, gratitude that did not barter. Then he turned back to the woman at his side. He searched her face for regret, and found only the wild, exact courage of someone who has crossed a bridge just wide enough for one and knows another has managed to place a foot beside hers. "I will go with you," he said, voice almost private now, though the hall could hear it if it chose. "To the lane." His throat tightened around the picture of two small bodies under a thin blanket. "We will bring them here together." Her eyes filled without spilling. "You know the way now," she said. "You will not lose it." He shook his head once. "Never." He released her hand only to step back one pace and speak to the chamberlain. "Food. Coal. Clothing sized for two," he said, in the same tone with which he might have ordered regiments into a pass. "Before the hour turns, discretion. No fuss." The man bowed and departed, quick and noiseless. The prince looked down then, at his own empty hand, at the memory in his palm of a child's weight curled around a toy carved without skill. He turned his hand over. The longing to have brought it now, to place that small horse on the cold marble and say, "Here is what matters," broke over him and went. He met the maid's gaze. "We will not leave it behind," he said softly. "Not the little horse, nor the life it held at night." She drew a breath that steadied them both. "No," she said. "We will not." The Queen descended one step from the dais. The movement was not quite blessing, not quite surrender. It made an aisle where none had been. The prince and the maid walked it side by side, the hall opening like a held mouth that had decided not to bite. At the doors, morning gathered itself in a brighter wash, the sky beyond a pale cut of blue. The prince paused, turned back once, and bowed. Not as a son taught to perform, but as a man acknowledging another who had chosen to be human when rank might have excused her. The Queen inclined her head in return, a single, spare concession that would cost her dearly and that she had decided to pay. He faced forward again. The maid's hand found his. It was easier now. The second moment of contact asked for less courage and gave more. They stepped into the corridor. It smelled of beeswax and stone, and a future that would not be tidy and did not need to be. They walked without guards, without fanfare, through rooms that had never seen a truth like theirs. Servants glanced up and then down again, an old training flickering against the new order like a candle learning to live with wind. At the outer door, the prince stopped. He turned toward her and pulled his cloak around her shoulders, not because she could not bear the cold, but because he wanted to mark this passage with a gesture that would enter his bones. He stood close enough to feel her breath, and far enough to make his respect clear. The air between them held a warmth entirely separate from clothing. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She thought. "Yes," she said, and not enough to step back. He smiled then, a small, precise thing, a man discovering at last what his own face felt like when it told the truth. "Good," he said. "We will be afraid together." They crossed the threshold and descended the steps. The courtyard received them. The city beyond waited, its lanes and rumors and hard edges, its children and their wooden talismans, its cruel talk and its stubborn mercies. The prince lifted his face to the morning. The maid lifted hers. For a moment, they were not any story anyone had ever told about people like them. They were simply two human beings who had chosen to walk toward a door and open it. He did not look back. They set out toward the street that had first taught him how small a room could hold how large a soul. As they passed under the gate, the guard on duty, who had been trained to salute only rank, found himself saluting something he could not name. The prince did not see him. He was listening to the sound of her footsteps beside his, sure and light, the sound of a life moving out of shadow. A carriage was brought, not the queen's. It had plain panels and strong wheels. He helped her in and climbed after her. Their knees brushed and did not move apart. He leaned once toward the window and watched the palace fall away, not with triumph, not with grief, only with the understanding that home had shifted its border and now included a crooked house on a narrow lane and two small children asleep beside a carved horse. "Tell me their names," he said. She spoke them, and the air changed shape to hold them. He closed his eyes and placed each name into that new room in him where vows live. When he opened them, the city had begun. They rode in silence, the kind that honors what speech cannot lift without breaking. Ahead, a lane waited with a window that had been mended with resin, and a door that remembered a hand pressed against it until courage came. The prince reached across the space and found her hand again. It fit, as if it had always been waiting. Not for a prince, but for the one man who would not pretend he was anything finer than human. They went to fetch the children and carry them into a morning that, for once, asked nothing of them but to wake. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.